It was a quiet Tuesday night, too quiet, in that eerie, unnatural way when even the refrigerator hum feels intrusive. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My checkbook lay open on the kitchen table, a small island of order in the wreckage of bills, receipts, and half-folded laundry. I remember tracing my pen over a column of numbers, my eyes blurring until they no longer looked like numbers at all, just symbols of exhaustion. I'd been trying to keep track of everything since Mark moved out temporarily, as he'd put it. Temporarily had become 6 months. 6 months of silence, excuses, and polite lies. Then my phone buzzed.
Sophie.
Her name, lighting up on the screen, was enough to soften everything inside me. My daughter. The reason I hadn't fallen apart completely. I smiled before answering. Hey, sweetheart. Burning the midnight oil again. Her laugh came through light and melodic, full of that unbroken faith only the young have. More like burning my brain. I just finished a paper on early childhood development. You'd be proud of me, Mom. I'm always proud of you, I said, leaning back in my chair. Did you get the transfer I sent last week? That should help with next month's rent and your books. Silence. Then, what transfer? I chuckled softly, thinking she was joking. The $2,000, honey. I sent it Friday morning. You should have gotten the alert. She hesitated. Mom, I haven't gotten money from you since March. My pen dropped to the table with a hollow clink. That's not possible. I've been sending it every month. You sure you checked? I check every week, she said, her tone suddenly worried. I thought you stopped because of, things being tight since Mark left. But you never said anything. Her words tangled in my head like threads knotted too tightly to undo. I opened my banking app with trembling fingers. There they were, every transfer listed neatly like obedient soldiers. April,
May, June, July.
Each labeled tuition and rent, each marked completed. Sophie, I see them right here. I whispered, more to myself than her. They went through. To what account? She asked. My stomach turned. I scrolled to the details. The account number didn't look familiar, except for the last 4 digits. I recognized them. It was the account Mark had set up years ago when Sophie started college. He'd said, let's make things easier. I'll manage the transfers from one place. I hadn't questioned it. I never questioned him when it came to money. He worked in finance. He was the expert. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred again, only this time with tears. Mom? What's wrong? Sophie's voice came through, small and scared. I swallowed hard. Nothing, sweetheart. Must be a banking mix-up. I'll sort it out, okay?
Don't worry about it.
But inside, a cold certainty was forming, one that made my skin prickle. After we hung up, I sat still for a long time, the phone pressed to my chest like I could stop my heart from racing if I just held it there. Then I opened my laptop. I went through every transfer again. Every cent that was supposed to go to my daughter had been quietly redirected to an account I didn't control. Mark's name appeared beside each transaction. My breath came shallow, uneven. The house felt different now, hostile, as though the walls themselves had been listening all along. I picked up the phone and called him. It rang twice before someone answered. But it wasn't him. A woman's voice, young, soft, careless, answered with a giggle. Hello. I froze. Who is this? Oh, she said after a pause, her tone shifting to a smug sweetness. He's in the shower. Want me to tell him you called? The line went silent before I could speak. Then the call ended. For a moment, I just stared at the phone, waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. The only sound in the house was the ticking of the kitchen clock, loud, deliberate, merciless. Each tick felt like a hammer striking the fragile shell of my life. I turned toward the living room where Mark's framed photo still sat on the mantel, him in a suit, smiling that measured, practiced smile that once made me feel safe. The overhead light flickered, catching on the glass of the frame. His eyes glimmered in reflection, almost mocking. I stood there until the air felt too heavy to breathe. Then I reached for the frame, ran my thumb across his face, and set it face down. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window. Somewhere deep in the house, a door creaked, that old sound the house made when it shifted at night. It used to comfort me. Tonight it sounded like a whisper I didn't want to hear. I sat back at the table, staring at the open checkbook, the numbers that had once meant control, order, stability. Now, they meant nothing. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. There are moments, I think, when your life doesn't break all at once. It cracks quietly, like ice on a winter lake. You don't even realize you're sinking until it's too late. And as the clock ticked past midnight, I realized I had been sinking for years. Looking back, I can still picture the first time I met Mark, the way his confidence filled the room like perfume, subtle but impossible to ignore. It was at the local bank, of all places, where I'd gone to close a joint account after my divorce. I was fumbling with paperwork, hands clammy, emotions frayed. He was the advisor who approached me with a practiced calm and an understanding smile. "Rough day," he'd asked gently, his voice low and even. "Rough year," I'd replied, forcing a smile I didn't feel. He didn't pry. He just nodded, handed me a pen, and said, "Let's get you organized. Chaos is expensive." That was Mark, efficient, soothing, and just authoritative enough to make you feel safe in your own vulnerability. He made decisions sound like kindness. I was 30 when we met. Newly single, exhausted from a marriage that had ended not in fire, but in slow, dull erosion. My ex-husband had been decent, but absent. A man who loved his work more than his family. When he left, I promised myself I'd be stronger, more independent, more careful. And yet, when Mark offered to help get my finances on track, I felt relief flood through me. He wasn't flashy. No gold watch, no exaggerated gestures. Just quiet confidence. When he explained things, interest rates, investments, tax shelters, he spoke in metaphors that made me laugh. "Think of it like a garden," he said once. "Money's the soil. You just need the right hands to tend it." I didn't realize I'd just handed him the shovel. We started seeing each other outside the bank, coffee after appointments, dinners that turned into long walks. He asked about Sophie, about my parents, about my job at the preschool. He listened like every word mattered. And after years of being invisible in my own home, that felt intoxicating. When he proposed, it wasn't dramatic. Just quiet and certain, like a statement of fact. We were sitting on my porch one night, the air thick with summer and cicadas. He took my hand, looked straight into my eyes, and said, "You've taken care of everyone your whole life, Elaine. Let me take care of you now." I said yes before I even thought about it. For a while, life really did feel easier. He handled the bills, the mortgage, the insurance. He set up an account for Sophie's college. He filed taxes before I even remembered they were due. I used to joke that I'd married a human spreadsheet. He'd smile that thin, patient smile of his and say, "You have better things to worry about than numbers." And I believed him because I wanted to. In those first few years, he was attentive in all the ways that make you lower your guard. Flowers on Thursdays. Texts saying, "Don't stay up too late grading papers." He remembered my parents' birthdays. When my father had a small stroke, Mark handled the hospital bills as if it were second nature. Everyone loved him. My mother used to say, "You finally found a man who thinks before he speaks." But my father, quiet, observant, wasn't convinced. "He manages too much, Elaine," he told me once, his voice low so Mark wouldn't hear. "You're losing track of your own name." I laughed it off, saying, "Dad, he's just helping." He looked at me for a long time. "That's what your mother used to say when I took over paying the bills." It took her 30 years to realize she'd stopped reading them. I remember brushing it aside. I thought Dad was being old-fashioned, protective. I didn't see the warning in his eyes, not until much later. The first red flag came 5 years in. A letter from the insurance company that said our policy had lapsed due to non-payment. I handed it to Mark, confused. "Oh, that's a clerical error," he said smoothly, slipping it into his briefcase. "Don't stress over it. I'll handle it." And just like that, I let him. There were other moments, little ones that, on their own, seemed harmless. Missing mail. A credit card bill that arrived late. A business trip that ran a day longer than planned. Once, I found an unfamiliar perfume lingering on his jacket. When I asked, he chuckled, kissed my forehead, and said, "You worry too much." Probably a client's wife at the dinner. I leaned in too close when she hugged me goodbye. I believed that, too, because it was easier than believing anything else. Mark had this way of calming my doubts by making them sound irrational. If I ever asked too many questions about money, he'd say, "You know finances make you anxious. Why put yourself through that stress?" When I'd hesitate, he'd soften. "I just want you to feel safe, Elaine. That's all." And he said it with such warmth that I mistook control for care. He was my protector, my manager, my buffer between the world and my fragile peace. He made me feel small, but in a way that seemed nurturing, like being cared for. That's the trick with men like him. They convince you the cage is a home. When Sophie turned 16, Mark threw her a birthday party that looked straight out of a magazine, string lights, a live band, even a chocolate fountain. I remember watching him that night, charming everyone, laughing easily with my parents, talking to her friends' fathers about investments. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt replaceable. That's the word that haunted me later. I remember overhearing one of my friends whisper to another, "Elaine's lucky. He's such a provider." I smiled when I heard it, but something inside me recoiled. Provider. As if I were some dependent creature who couldn't survive without him. But I was tired then, tired of carrying the weight of the past, of worrying about bills, of trying to be mother and father both. Mark's confidence gave me permission to stop fighting. So I surrendered. Looking back, I think the moment I truly disappeared wasn't when he started lying, it was when I stopped asking. He once told me, "Money's not emotional, Elaine. That's why you shouldn't handle it." And I nodded because I was emotional, because I'd been taught that feeling deeply made me weak. But now, as I sit here, remembering that version of myself, I see how clever his words were. He didn't just handle the money.
He handled me.
Sometimes I still dream of that porch night, the fireflies, his hand on mine, the scent of lilacs in the air. I can hear his voice, calm and certain. "Let me take care of you now." It used to sound like love. Now it sounds like the beginning of a quiet theft, not of money, but of my life. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same one where my world had split just hours earlier, surrounded by printouts, receipts, and my laptop's dull glow. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and panic. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock, pressed against my skull like static. It started as an act of disbelief. I wasn't searching for betrayal, not really. I was searching for a mistake. Something to tell me that the system glitched, that Sophie's account number was entered wrong, that somehow Mark was innocent, or, at least, oblivious. But denial doesn't last long when truth stares you in the face with dollar signs. My cursor hovered over the bank login, the same password Mark had once set up for me, to make things easy. His phrase. He used it like a charm. "Let me make things easy for you, Elaine." When the numbers appeared, my breath stopped. The balances were lower than I'd remembered, much lower. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the transactions, each line item a knife. Transfers, withdrawals, payments to entities I didn't recognize. ML Consulting, Silverpine Holdings, Aurora Capital. Names that sounded legitimate, professional, even, but my gut told me they were ghosts. I searched each one. The results were a void. No business records, no websites. Just blank space. Then, one link appeared, a property listing, 6 months old. A condo purchased in full, cash payment, under Silverpine Holdings. The address was in the city, near the water. And the buyer of record? Mark L. Harrison. My mouth went dry. The cursor blinked in silence, as if waiting for me to breathe again. By 2 a.m., I'd lost count of how many folders I'd opened, how many PDFs I'd downloaded and renamed. Somewhere between the statements and the property record, I found the first email. It was in the sent folder of an old Gmail account Mark had once set up for joint financial matters. I'd forgotten the password, but I remembered the recovery question. Where did we meet? Conference room, I typed. The inbox opened like a wound. The emails weren't between us. They were between him and a woman named Rachel. The earliest dated back almost 3 years. Each one dripped with casual intimacy, hotel bookings, wire transfers, dinner reservations. Then later, messages that made my skin crawl. Can't wait to wake up next to you in the condo. I moved more funds today. She doesn't notice. She never does. Don't worry, love. I'll take care of everything.
I stared at that last line.
The same words he'd said to me, over and over. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. I clicked on a photo attachment. There he was, Mark, smiling under city lights, his arm wrapped around a woman maybe half my age. Her hair was long and golden, her eyes bright, her hand resting possessively on his chest. Behind them, the waterfront shimmered. My heart made a sound I didn't know hearts could make. Morning came, without sunlight. The sky was gray, as if it too refused to look at me. I called his office. The receptionist paused when she heard my name, then transferred me directly. He answered on the third ring. Elaine, he said, voice calm, almost bored. It's early. What's wrong?
Don't do that, I said.
My voice was shaking, brittle with exhaustion. Don't talk to me like nothing's wrong. He sighed, the kind of sigh that made me feel small. What are you talking about? I found everything, I said. The accounts, the transfers, the condo, her. Silence. Then a quiet laugh. You've been going through my files again? Our files, I corrected. My money, my daughter's future. He chuckled once, the sound cold and dismissive. Elaine, you never cared about the details before. You wanted things handled. I handled them. I gripped the phone so hard my fingers ached. You stole from me. No, he said smoothly. I managed things. You spent years falling apart, remember? Someone had to keep the lights on. Someone had to think ahead. You took my trust, I said. You took what you freely gave. That stopped me cold. There it was, his truth. Not guilt, not remorse. Just ownership. As if my trust was a currency he had the right to spend. You never asked questions before, he continued, his tone almost lazy. You were happy not knowing. That sentence hit harder than the lies. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the arrogance, the certainty that I'd stay quiet, compliant, grateful. I hung up before my sobs could break through. When I got home, I barely made it past the kitchen before collapsing. I dropped to the floor and dry heaved until my ribs hurt. All the years I'd convinced myself that peace was better than confrontation, that silence meant stability, it all turned to acid in my throat. I sat there, back against the cabinets, staring at the fridge where Sophie's childhood drawings still clung by fading magnets. Crayon hearts, stick figures, a family holding hands. I whispered to the empty room. You broke everything. But somewhere in that silence, another voice stirred, quiet but solid.
No.
He didn't break you. Not yet. I stood, my legs trembling, and turned on my computer. A new folder appeared on my desktop, its title stark and simple. Proof. I filled it with screenshots, statements, and photos until my fingers cramped. Every click, every saved file, every renamed document felt like reclaiming something, an inch of power, a piece of breath, a fragment of self. When I finished, I stared at the folder for a long time. The anger inside me was still small, still fragile, but it was alive. That night, I couldn't eat. I walked through the house like a ghost, touching things that had once been ours. The jacket he'd left on the chair. His aftershave still lingering in the bathroom air. The faint indentation his side of the bed had made in the mattress. Every object had become evidence, not of a crime, but of how thoroughly I'd let myself vanish. The next morning, I boxed up his things. The sound of folding shirts, of zippers closing, was almost meditative. When I was done, I placed his wedding ring on top of the pile. It had once been a promise. Now it was a period. I looked around my kitchen, the same one where it began, and whispered to the clock ticking on the wall. You were right to keep time. I just wasn't listening. Then I took a deep breath, opened my laptop again, and began typing names into a search bar. Lawyers, investigators, anyone who could help me turn proof into something undeniable. I didn't know yet what justice would look like. But I knew this. I would not be erased. Not again. The night I left, I didn't cry. Maybe I had already used up every tear I owned. Maybe I just didn't want him to have the satisfaction of imagining me falling apart. It was early, around 4 in the morning. The kind of hour where even the shadows seemed to hold their breath. I moved through the house like a stranger, each step echoing softly against the wooden floorboards. I packed only what I needed, my laptop, a few clothes, my journals, and the worn shoebox now stuffed with evidence. Proof. The rest, I left behind. The furniture we'd picked out together, the photographs of vacations that now felt staged, the expensive coffee maker he'd once bragged about buying, just for me. I didn't even take the wedding ring. It sat in the kitchen drawer, cold against the silverware. I touched it once, not out of longing, but to feel its weight one last time, then closed the drawer gently. When I walked out, dawn was just beginning to brush the sky with the faintest light. The air smelled like rain and endings. My car, a small silver sedan that still smelled faintly of Sophie's perfume from the summer, waited in the driveway. I slid behind the wheel, looked once in the rearview mirror at the house, our house, and said softly, "You can have the walls, Mark. The rest of me is leaving." Then I drove. I didn't go far, just an hour east, to a small coastal town called Willow Harbor. It wasn't a dramatic escape, just quiet. The kind that doesn't make headlines. The kind that saves you. I found a rental through a local listing, a one-bedroom cottage behind a row of sand dunes, paint peeling, porch crooked, but with windows that opened toward the sea. The landlady didn't ask questions. She handed me the keys, her eyes kind but cautious, as if she could sense the ghosts trailing behind me. For the first few days, I moved like a woman underwater. Time felt distorted. The days melted into one another, shaped only by the rhythm of the waves and the slow hum of solitude. I unpacked slowly. My journals went on the nightstand. The box of documents stayed under the bed. I didn't hang pictures. I didn't have any that didn't hurt. But I did make coffee each morning. Just one mug. Just for me. And somehow, that small act felt radical. Sophie called a few times that first week. Her voice carried warmth and lightness, untouched by the chaos she didn't yet know. "Mom, you sound different," she said once.
Do I?
I asked, forcing a smile she couldn't see.
Yeah. Calmer.
"Are you okay?"
I paused.
The truth perched at the edge of my throat but didn't leap. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just taking some time for myself."
She seemed satisfied with that.
Maybe because, for the first time in years, it wasn't entirely a lie. When we hung up, I sat by the window, watching the ocean darken as the tide receded. The skies stretched endlessly, and I realized no one knew where I was. Not Mark, not his lawyer, not the people who used to fill my life with noise. For the first time, the quiet wasn't frightening. It was mine. A week later, I found the bookstore. It sat on the corner of Main Street, tucked between a bakery and a shop that sold seashell wind chimes. The sign read The Turning Page, and the air inside smelled like old paper, cinnamon tea, and dust. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with bright eyes and silver hair pinned into a bun. She looked up from her crossword and smiled when I entered. "Looking for something in particular, dear?" she asked. "Maybe peace," I said before I could stop myself. She chuckled softly. "Aisle 3, right between poetry and philosophy." Her name was Marjorie. Within a week, I was working part-time for her, shelving books, managing inventory, sweeping floors that didn't need sweeping. The pay was modest, but it wasn't about the money. It was about motion, routine, breathing again, without a script written by someone else. Marjorie never pried, but she noticed things. The way my hands shook when I counted change, the faraway look that would take over when the store got too quiet. One afternoon, as I was stacking a pile of used novels, she said gently, "You don't have to burn yourself to keep someone else warm." I froze. my fingers still pressed against the spine of a book. She didn't look up from the register, just added, "Some of us learn that too late. But learning it at all still counts." I nodded, and for a moment, my eyes blurred. At night, I began reading again, something I hadn't done in years. My journals filled with entries that didn't sound like apologies anymore. I wrote about the sea, the color of the morning light, the smell of rain on sand. I wrote about anger that felt less like fire and more like clarity. I also started therapy online in the evenings. The therapist's voice was steady, compassionate, and sometimes painfully honest. She told me something that stuck. "You can't heal in the same room where you were hurt." That sentence became my quiet mantra. Every time I missed the old house, or the illusion of it, I repeated those words until the ache softened. I took back my accounts, too.
Piece by piece.
The lawyer I'd hired helped me reclaim the funds Mark had siphoned through fraud. It wasn't easy. The paperwork was exhausting, the process slow, but each document I signed felt like a reclamation of self. He fought back, of course. Emails full of indignation, threats wrapped in civility. "We can work this out privately," he wrote once. "No need to ruin both our lives." I didn't reply. He'd already ruined enough. As weeks passed, healing began to arrive in fragments. The sound of seagulls crying at dawn. The warmth of sunlight filtering through lace curtains. The taste of black coffee made exactly how I liked it. I'd walk to the beach every evening after closing the shop. The ocean was a living thing, constant, unpredictable, cleansing. I watched the waves erase footprints from the sand and thought about how beautiful it was that something could begin again every few seconds. The first time I saw a storm roll in over the horizon, I stood barefoot on the wet sand, wind whipping my hair, rain stinging my skin. I didn't move. I let the sky break open and wash over me. It felt like baptism, not of faith, but of truth. One night, after another long day at the store, I sat outside on the porch, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The air was cool, the sea restless, but forgiving. I closed my eyes and whispered into the wind, "I'm still here." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was trying to convince myself. The ocean answered with a soft hush, like agreement. I wasn't healed, not fully. The past still lived under my skin, in small echoes and reflexes. But I was learning that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant surviving beautifully. And maybe that was enough. The ocean no longer sounded like sorrow to me. It sounded like rhythm, like the steady, relentless pulse of something that refused to die. Months had passed since I left the house on Sycamore Lane. The woman who once walked out trembling and hollow now woke before dawn, brewed her own coffee, and opened her laptop with purpose. I had stopped counting the days since I'd left him. Instead, I started counting what I was reclaiming, one truth at a time. My mornings began with research. Financial law, digital forensics, fraud recovery. It was a strange, new language at first, but I devoured it the way a starving person eats, greedily, desperately, determined to never hunger for ignorance again. I joined online forums for women who'd been controlled by their partners, emotionally, financially, legally. Their stories bled into mine, each one a variation of the same silent theft. Women who had been told they were bad with money, too emotional, not business-minded. Women who'd been made to believe that dependence was love. Every message, every shared story, lit a small fire in me. I started responding, sharing what I'd learned, helping others find the courage to look at their own statements, their own shared accounts. It felt purposeful. For the first time, I wasn't drowning in what Mark had done. I was building something from it. Then one afternoon, my lawyer called. "Elaine," she said gently, "you might want to sit down."
I did.
She explained how Mark had used my parents' names, their retirement identities, as co-signers on several business loans he'd taken under a fabricated company. Each loan carried tens of thousands of dollars in liability. My parents had no idea. Their credit, their savings, their very names, all entangled in his deceit. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I could handle what he did to me, maybe even forgive it someday. But not this.
Not them.
My parents had lived their entire lives with quiet dignity. They'd raised me through storms, built their world out of sweat and modest dreams. And now their trust, the same trust that had once warned me, had been weaponized against them. Something inside me clicked, like the final piece of a lock sliding open. The time for quiet healing was over. It was time to go home. When I arrived at my parents' house, the scent of baked apples and old wood wrapped around me like a memory. My mother opened the door, her face brightening, then softening as she saw my expression. "Elaine," she whispered. "Honey, what's wrong?" We sat at the same kitchen table where, years ago, I'd once told them I was marrying Mark. My father had sat silent then, his disapproval written in the tight line of his mouth. Now he sat across from me again, older, frilier, his hands trembling slightly on the table. I took a breath. "Dad. Mom, there's something I need to tell you." It took an hour to get through it all. The accounts. The loans. The fake company. The co-signatures forged under their names. My mother wept softly, her hands shaking against her teacup. My father didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was hoarse. "He used us." I nodded. He leaned back in his chair, staring past me. When Sophie asked, "What money?" we thought maybe she'd misunderstood. That line, "what money?" hung in the air like a ghost. And just like that, the betrayal became bigger than me. It became a family wound. That night, after my mother went to bed, my father and I sat in the dark living room, a lamp casting a soft circle of light between us. "I should have stopped you," he said quietly. "When you told me you were marrying him, I knew he wanted control. I saw it in his eyes." I reached for his hand. "You couldn't have stopped me, Dad. I needed to learn it the hard way." He gave a bitter chuckle. "And now you'll unlearn it the hard way too." "Maybe," I said, meeting his gaze. "But this time, I know exactly what I'm doing." The next few weeks became a blur of paperwork, signatures, and long hours spent at the courthouse. My parents gave me legal authorization to act on their behalf, and my lawyer, and I built the case piece by piece. Mark's confidence had always been his weakness. He'd left a trail, emails, transfers, invoices. Every false statement was another thread I tugged until the whole thing began to unravel. Each night, I'd return to my parents' guest room with new evidence, scanning it into the growing folder labeled proof, the same one I'd started on that awful night months ago. Only now it wasn't about desperation. It was about precision. And then came the surprise. An email from an address I didn't recognize. "We need to talk, it's about Mark." At first, I ignored it. But when a second message came, followed by a third, my curiosity won. The sender was a woman named Ava. Her tone was cautious but direct. "I think you're the woman he was married to," she wrote. "He told me you were mentally unstable, that you'd stolen money from him. I found some things. You deserve to see them."
Ava.
The younger woman from the photos. The one who, in another life, I might have hated. We agreed to meet in a small cafe near the city courthouse. She was beautiful in that easy, careless way of someone who hasn't yet learned to hide pain. But when she saw me, her confidence flickered. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "I swear, Elaine, I didn't know he was still married." "I believe you," I said softly. Her eyes widened. "You do?"
"Yes."
"Because I once believed every lie he told me to." She looked down, tears slipping through her mascara. From her purse, she pulled out a flash drive and placed it on the table between us. "I recorded him once," she said. "He was drunk, bragging. Said it was so easy to manipulate emotional women, that you never questioned him, that I wouldn't either. I kept it because I think part of me already knew what he was." I stared at the small silver drive like it was a weapon made of truth. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked. She met my eyes, her voice shaking. "Because I want to be free too." Back in my parents' house that night, I listened to the recording. Mark's voice was unmistakable, smooth, self-assured, venom wrapped in silk. "She's just grateful," he said. "That's how you control them. Make them think you're saving them. Then they'll sign anything." There was laughter, not mine, not Ava's, but his. The sound of a man so certain of his untouchability. I sat there for a long time after it ended, staring at the computer screen. Then I hit save as and titled the file confession. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I planned. Every strategy session, every legal consultation, every sleepless night turned into momentum. I wasn't acting from vengeance anymore. I was acting from clarity. I wanted the truth to stand on its own legs, without the weight of my pain bending it. I reached out to the women from the online forums, those who'd once shared their stories with me. I started a small collective. We met virtually, sharing resources, connecting others with lawyers and therapists. I called it the Ledger Project, a name that felt poetic, considering where my story began. Helping others made my own anger gentler. Not smaller, but cleaner. Mark had built his life on secrecy. I was building mine on light. When my lawyer told me the court date had been set, I didn't flinch. By then, the woman who had once hidden behind silence no longer existed. The morning before I was to see him again, I stood before the mirror, brushing my hair. The reflection staring back wasn't flawless, but it was mine. There were lines on my face that hadn't been there before, but they spoke of endurance, not weakness. I put on a simple necklace, one my mother had given me when Sophie was born. A symbol of beginnings. And as I fastened it, I whispered, "You wanted control, Mark. You taught me how to take it back." When I returned to Willow Harbor that evening, the tide was high, the waves fierce. I stood by the shoreline, the cold water washing over my feet. The sky was bruised purple and gold, the horizon endless. I realized something then. Revenge was never about making him suffer. It was about remembering who I was before he convinced me I was small. I wasn't small anymore. I was vast, like the ocean. And tomorrow, he would finally see what it meant to face a woman who came back to herself. The mediation room was cold, clinical, and silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every heartbeat. Elaine sat at the long oak table, a folder in front of her, her hands folded calmly. The city skyline glimmered through the tall windows, indifferent to the drama about to unfold. Across from her, Mark entered with that same smooth confidence he always wore like armor. He adjusted his cufflinks, gave a quick nod to his lawyer, then to Elaine, casual, almost dismissive. "Elaine," he said, his tone lined with false politeness. "You look well." "I wasn't expecting." She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed on the papers in front of her, unflinching. Her lawyer began the session, explaining the terms of mediation, the expectation of civility, the mutual goal of resolving outstanding financial matters. Mark smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair, radiating the ease of a man who believed he still held control. Then the first document hit the table. A printout of a transaction list. Dozens of transfers from Elaine's accounts into shell companies under Mark's name. The lawyer's tone was even, professional. "Mr. Kessler, can you explain these?" Mark's brow creased slightly. Business restructuring. Everything was in the family's best interest. Elaine said nothing. Another document slid forward. Bank statements, emails, asset summaries. And then the photos. A condo deed in Miami. Jewelry purchases. 2 plane tickets to Paris dated during their daughter's senior year, a trip Elaine never knew about. Mark's smirk faltered. "Elaine," he began, his voice softening into condescension. "You're misunderstanding what this is. These things were complicated. Investments. Tax shelters. You always said you didn't want to deal with the finances." Her lawyer cut in. "Mr. Kessler, these accounts were opened using falsified business identities. That's not a tax shelter. That's fraud." Mark's jaw tightened. He glanced at Elaine, searching for her usual hesitation, the trace of self-doubt he'd always relied on to regain control. But it wasn't there. What he found instead was composure. Elaine looked up slowly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. "You didn't just steal money," she said quietly. "You stole years of my life. I can never invoice you for." The room went still. For the first time, Mark didn't have a comeback. Her lawyer continued the methodical unspooling, the fraudulent loans signed under her parents' names, the offshore transfers, the manipulations labeled as consulting income. Every piece of evidence stacked like a tower of truth, impossible to ignore. Finally, the lawyer played the audio file. Mark's voice filled the room, recorded laughter, arrogance, the unmistakable smugness of a man who thought he was untouchable. "It's easy," he said on the recording. "You just make them feel taken care of. Emotional women, they'll sign anything if you make it sound like love." Elaine didn't flinch. She had listened to that recording enough times in private to numb the sting. But seeing his face as he heard himself, the twitch in his jaw, the widening of his eyes, that was new. When the audio ended, no one spoke. Even his lawyer looked uneasy. Mark finally broke the silence, his voice trembling under a thin veneer of calm. "This is entrapment. You can't." "It's a confession," Elaine's lawyer replied evenly. "And it will be submitted with the other documentation. You've committed financial fraud, identity misuse, and coercive control. We're not here to debate morality. We're here to document consequences." Mark turned toward Elaine, desperation flickering beneath his practiced charm. "We don't have to do this, Lainey. We can fix this together. You and me. We built the life." She leaned forward slightly, her expression soft but final. "You built illusions. I just lived inside them." He froze, as if the air had been pulled from the room. Her lawyer concluded the session efficiently, outlining restitution, asset seizure, and pending legal action. Mark's signature was required at the bottom of several pages. He hesitated before each one, as though signing away not just wealth, but the illusion of superiority. Elaine watched in silence as he scribbled his name. Every stroke of the pen felt like the quiet undoing of years of deceit. When it was over, Mark stood abruptly. "You'll regret this," he muttered, voice low, but there was no conviction behind it, just exhaustion. Elaine rose slowly, gathering her papers with precision. "No," she said. "I already regretted staying quiet." She left the room without looking back. Outside, winter had wrapped the city in pale light. The air bit at her cheeks, crisp and honest. For the first time in years, she could feel her breath move freely through her chest. No weight pressing it down. No invisible leash tightening around her ribs. She walked without rushing, each step deliberate, grounded. When she reached the courthouse steps, she paused and tilted her head upward. The sky was the color of steel, but it didn't feel cold anymore. She smiled faintly. "It's over," she whispered. But it wasn't defeat she felt. It was release. Weeks later, Elaine stood outside a college campus, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Sophie spotted her from across the courtyard, her scarf fluttering in the wind. "Mom," she called out, smiling. Elaine waved, warmth blooming in her chest. They found a bench under a cluster of bare trees, their branches skeletal, but still reaching for light. Sophie took the cup, studying her mother's face. "You look lighter," she said softly. "Different. Happier." Elaine exhaled, a long, steady breath. "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine." Sophie frowned slightly, confused but thoughtful. Then she smiled, a small, knowing smile that reminded Elaine so much of herself before life had dulled her edges. They sat in silence, sipping coffee, watching the sun descend behind the buildings. It wasn't the same life she had before, but it was hers, every inch of it earned. A few days later, Elaine walked into the same bank that once represented her prison. The lobby smelled of polished wood and lemon cleaner. She approached the counter with quiet resolve. "I'd like to close an account," she said. The teller nodded, typing briskly. "Name? Elaine Kessler." The sound of her name, untethered from his, filled her with something close to joy. As the teller printed the final confirmation slip, Elaine looked around. The glass doors reflected her image back at her. Older, yes, but grounded. Whole. No longer the woman who waited for permission. She folded the paper neatly, slipped it into her purse, and walked out into the cold afternoon. The wind caught her hair, lifting it just enough to feel alive against her neck. That night, she sat by the window of her coastal apartment, the ocean's rhythm pulsing beyond the glass. A candle flickered beside her laptop. She opened the folder labeled Proof. Then she created a new one. Freedom. Inside, she began drafting an article, not for revenge, but for remembrance. How financial abuse disguises itself as love. Her words flowed, calm and cutting, each one reclaiming a piece of her that had been stolen. By midnight, she closed the laptop, tears pricking her eyes, not of grief, but gratitude. She whispered to herself, "I came back." And somewhere in the distance, the waves crashed, as if to answer, "Yes, you did." The next morning, Elaine walked along the shore. The tide was low, and her footprints lingered behind her, a visible record of movement, of persistence. She thought about everything she'd lost, and realized it had simply made space for what she'd become. Her marriage was over. Her bank account emptied and rebuilt. Her trust shattered and reforged. But her voice, the one Mark tried so hard to silence, was alive again, steady and strong. She stopped at the edge of the water, feeling the cold foam kiss her shoes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost in her own story. She was the author. And this chapter, she knew, would not end in loss, but in legacy. Elaine closes her old bank account, steps through the glass doors into the winter sun, and pauses just long enough to catch her reflection, whole, unbroken, and entirely hers again. The woman who once whispered apologies now walks forward, without looking back, because survival was never her ending. It was her beginning.